Guys, we're almost there. The 2024 Player's Handbook for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition is almost ready to be released. I personally do not have a copy of the book yet. I know some people that went to Gen Con are lucky enough to have a copy, but I've been looking into all the information that I can about the new upcoming changes, and I am extremely excited for some of the things that are coming in the 2024 Player's Handbook. I've already started plotting what my next character is going to be for my next campaign in Dungeons & Dragons, and as I'm going through it, I get a little sad because I'm like, man, I wish I could do some of these things in Baldur's Gate 3. So today, we are going to talk about changes that I would love to see inside of Baldur's Gate 3 to bring the game up to speed with the 2024 Player's Handbook. I'll go ahead and note that I know some of these things are available to PC players through the use of mods, and I have some of those mods already installed and am using them. But we're going to ignore those things, one, because I want a reason to geek out about Dungeons & Dragons and make a video about Baldur's Gate 3, so get off my back. And number two, I'm not sure if all of these things are available for mods. Maybe they are when this video comes out and they're not when I'm recording it. It's hard to keep up with the mod scene because there are a ton of mods out there for Baldur's Gate 3 and for video games in general. So forget about the mods. Let's talk about things that we would love to see inside of Baldur's Gate 3 from the 2024 Player's Handbook Warlock Edition. I'm limiting this to Warlocks because one, Warlock, my favorite class in Dungeons & Dragons, and also because we would be here for literal hours if we didn't limit the scope of this video in some way. If you enjoy the video, don't forget to hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the notification bell so you get notifications of videos like this. Let's talk about things we want from the 2024 Player's Handbook for the Warlock inside of Baldur's Gate 3. Update number 1. Give me the updated cantrips, please. I know this is available in mods, or at least kind of a version of these, but I desperately want to see the updated mods, especially for True Strike and Blade Ward inside of Baldur's Gate 3. If you're not aware, True Strike is going to be completely different than what you're used to. Currently, you use an action for True Strike to give yourself advantage on your next attack roll, which is completely silly, and it's the worst cantrip probably in the game. If you're not aware though, the updated version of True Strike is going to allow you to make a melee or ranged weapon attack, similar to that of like Booming Blade or Green Flame Blade, and it's going to use your spellcasting modifier in place of strength or dexterity. It is then going to enable you to deal radiant damage instead of bludgeoning, piercing, or slashing if you so choose. Personally, I love this for the Warlock because with some other things we'll talk about in a second, it finally opens us up to a Warlock that doesn't just only cast Eldritch Blast as their action. They're not so predictable anymore. And it gives you more than like the two options of I can play a Hexblade with Great Weapon Master, Polearm Master, and a giant ass weapon, or I can play as a Warlock that does Eldritch Blast. It gives you some more options. Blade Ward, potentially the second worst cantrip in the game, which allowed you to use an action to give yourself resistance to bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage for 2 turns, has also been reworked. I'm not sure how often I will use this in Dungeons & Dragons because it is going to conflict with the use of Hex, but Blade Ward is going to become a concentration spell, which is going to enable you to inflict a 1d4 penalty to your opponent's attack rolls. This is different to the 1D&D Blade Ward that is currently available as a mod in Baldur's Gate 3, which is a reaction to impose disadvantage. This new Blade Ward is going to be concentration based though, so it's probably only going to be useful against small tier fights. When you're doing big fights, big boss fights, then you're probably going to be wanting to concentrate on bigger and better spells. And even then in smaller tiers of combat, you're probably going to want to be focusing on Hex. So it's tough to say, but I love the change to Blade Ward anyways, and I would welcome that in Baldur's Gate 3. Next up, this one is going to be huge. For D&D 5e, I'm not an expert. I want this to be seen. I started playing Dungeons & Dragons this year. I do not claim at all to be an expert on Dungeons & Dragons, but this one, they buffed Cloud of Daggers so that you can now move your Cloud of Daggers with an action, which seems wild because Cloud of Daggers is already so powerful in Dungeons & Dragons. So that's crazy for me that they would make that buff, but I would love that buff specifically in Baldur's Gate 3, and here is why. At least the way that I have played Dungeons & Dragons, we don't let people like kind of go a little bit around. Like if it's cutting through half of a square, it takes up that square. So it's not like Baldur's Gate 3 where in Dungeons & Dragons, you can't like kind of just go 1 pixel outside of the edge of a Cloud of Daggers. Like you can completely block a doorway with a Cloud of Daggers. And that is very hard to do in Baldur's Gate 3. And once someone walks around it, and maybe you didn't place it just right and they go around it, now your Cloud of Daggers is basically wasted. It's just sitting there. The ability to reposition your Cloud of Daggers in Baldur's Gate 3 is huge because you don't have like a Hex or a square-based grid system where you can reliably make sure that you're blocking specific pathways. This is going to make it far more valuable over the course of an entire battle and make it worthy of your concentration because that area of effect is pretty small. I love Cloud of Daggers for, the Bard and for the Warlock, and I think that that's going to be a great addition, and I would love to see that come to Baldur's Gate 3. Now, for entry number 3, this is going to be the Cliff's Notes version of the Eldritch Invocation changes because there are a ton of changes coming to Eldritch Invocations in the 2024 Player's Handbook. One of them being that the Pact of the Blade, the Pact of the Tome, and the Pact of the Chain are no longer going to be pact boons. You don't have to pick one of them. They are getting moved into Eldritch Evocations that you pick at first level. It's really cool because now they are not going to be mutually exclusive. You can have a Pact of a Tome, Chain, and Blade Warlock should you want that. Additionally, there are some massive upgrades coming to Eldritch Invocations that I want to talk about, and a few explicit ones that I would love to see in Baldur's Gate 3. One of them you can get from a mod, and that is the change to the Pact of the Blade, which on top of allowing you to summon a pact weapon and use your spellcasting modifier to use it, you can also change the damage type to any of psychic, necrotic, or radiant damage, depending on what you want. That is straight up massive. And I want that really bad. I love having that with my mod in Baldur's Gate 3. I wish that was kind of baked into the game. But let's talk about the big one. The big one that I'm really excited about, and that is that Agonizing Blast and Repelling Blast are no longer going to be locked down to Eldritch Blast. That is going to open up more possibilities and more versatility for your Warlock, so you're not just having to cast Eldritch Blast for every single action. Now, the one restriction they're putting on it is that Agonizing Blast, you have to pick the cantrip that gets Agonizing Blast when you take it. Agonizing Blast doesn't just apply to all of your Warlock cantrips, which I think is fair. So for example, we talked about True Strike just a minute ago. So now you have True Strike, which is going to deal your normal weapon damage with radiant damage, whether that be because you're doing Pact of the Blade or just because True Strike can change it to radiant damage. You get to add your spellcasting modifier because you're making an attack roll with damage. So you get to add your +4, +5, +3, whatever it is, to your damage roll. And then you can add your Agonizing Blast damage on top of that to get even more out of True Strike. Similarly, Repelling Blast is also going to work in that way. You just have to make sure that you're using a cantrip that requires an attack roll, like True Strike, Eldritch Blast. This won't work though with something like Toll the Dead or Sacred Flame, which requires a saving throw. So you can now use True Strike, add your Agonizing Blast damage, and knock someone back with it. Massive fan, huge fan, love it. I also want to point out, just because whenever I ranked all of the Eldritch Invocations for Baldur's Gate 3, I gave this one an awful rating because I couldn't think of a way to use it. One with the shadows now just allows you to cast invisibility instead of the fact that like you had to not be moving and then you become invisible, like a massive buff to that. Can we get that in Baldur's Gate 3, pretty please? Now for entry number 4, what I'm really excited about is whenever you were playing, depending on which patron you picked, whether that's the Great Old One, the Archfey, or the Fiend, you get patron spells that are added to your spell list that you can pick from every time that you level up. And that was great, and it gave you options to things like Slow and Fireball, but you still had to pick one versus the other. Like you had to pick, do I want Fireball or do I want something like Hunger of Hadar? In the 2024 Player's Handbook, you just get your patron spells. Your patrons are giving you a gift and you always have these spells prepared. I believe there are mods that enable you to do this as well inside of Baldur's Gate 3, but I would love that to be baked into the game. I just get my patron spells, don't have to pick them. That's a massive buff. And for number 5, one more thing that I would love to be added into Baldur's Gate 3 is the new Celestial subclass. Now I know the Celestial subclass, I believe it was added in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, so it's not new, but it's new to the 2024 Player's Handbook, and it integrates very well with some of these new features we've already talked about. The Celestial subclass was already decent because it dabbled a little bit in the Cleric and it dabbled a little bit in like the Paladin, and it was just like, okay. But the problem was that some of its abilities, like its level 6 ability where you can deal extra damage with radiant damage, was such a trap because you didn't have enough times where you were dealing radiant damage, like you were casting a spell or using a spell slot. But now, with the addition of True Strike, the ability to do radiant damage with a cantrip, you can now add your charisma modifier again onto your True Strike. I believe it's called Radiant Soul, something like that. I can't remember what it's called, but I'm super excited that now I think the Celestial subclass is going to reach new levels because of some of the new features within the Warlock itself. I am planning in my next campaign to be a Celestial Warlock. I think it's just going to be fun and flavorful. And I mean, spoiler alert, there is a mod out there for Baldur's Gate 3. I have it installed. That's what I'm playing right now in Baldur's Gate 3. I'm very excited, so I would love it if that got added into the base game. No, I'm not silly. I know that Larian has kind of washed their hands of Baldur's Gate 3, said we're done, we made a cool thing, we're moving on to bigger and better things. This is not like I demand this happen. This is a reason I wanted to talk about Baldur's Gate 3. I wanted to talk about Dungeons & Dragons. I'm realistic, but if they added those things into the game, that would be super dope. But guys, let me know, what do you think they should add into Baldur's Gate 3 from the 2024 rule changes? Do you have anything you're excited for? Is there anything that you're losing that you're sad about? Let me know those down in the comments. If you don't have anything to say, go ahead and just comment your favorite emoji down below because it goes towards engagement. It is a massive help to the channel and I greatly appreciate it. Guys, I'm super excited for the 2024 Player's Handbook. We'll be back hopefully with another video at some point to talk about other things I'm excited about. Might be after I get the rulebook and I actually know what's in there, and now I know, oh man, I'm really missing that inside of Baldur's Gate 3. We'll see what happens, but guys, we will see you in a later video. Have a great day. Thank you guys for watching. We'll see you later.